What if I told you that stupidity isn't just the absence of intelligence, but something far more insidious, a force that can transform brilliant minds into instruments of destruction? What if the greatest threat to civilization isn't evil people doing evil things, but ordinary people who have simply stopped thinking? Picture this. A renowned scientist with multiple degrees suddenly starts believing and spreading dangerous misinformation. A compassionate teacher begins endorsing harmful ideologies. A loving parent starts making decisions that endanger their own children. These aren't evil people, they're intelligent, well-meaning individuals who have fallen victim to what Schopenhauer called the power of stupidity. And here's what makes this truly terrifying. It's not happening to other people, it's happening to people just like you and me. This isn't just philosophical speculation. In 1961, Stanley M. Graham conducted his infamous obedience experiments at Yale University. Ordinary volunteers were instructed by an authority figure to administer what they believed were increasingly painful electric shocks to another person. Despite hearing screams of agony, 65% of participants delivered shocks they thought could be lethal. These weren't sadists or mentally ill. They were normal people who had temporarily surrendered their capacity for independent moral judgment. This is exactly what Schopenhauer witnessed firsthand in Nazi Germany, and it led him to develop one of the most unsettling theories about human nature ever conceived. But before we dive deeper, I have to ask, have you ever found yourself believing something simply because everyone around you believed it? 2. Keep that question in mind as we explore what might be one of the most important psychological insights of the modern era. Schopenhauer wasn't your typical philosopher sitting in an ivory tower, pondering abstract ideas. He was a German Lutheran pastor who watched his entire society transform before his eyes. Born in 1906 into an intellectual family, his father was a prominent psychiatrist and neurologist. Schopenhauer had every reason to believe in the power of education and rational discourse. But as the Nazi Party rose to power, Schopenhauer witnessed something that shattered his faith in human rationality. He watched as his fellow Germans, educated, cultured, religious people, began supporting policies and leaders that contradicted everything they claimed to believe. These weren't ignorant masses being manipulated by clever propaganda. These were professors, doctors, clergy members, and intellectuals who were actively participating in their own intellectual surrender. From his prison cell in 1943, waiting to be executed for his role in a plot to assassinate Hitler, Bonhoeffer wrote what would become his most haunting observation. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. Neither protests nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reasons fall on deaf ears. What made this observation so chilling wasn't just its context, but its precision. Evil, he noted, always carries within itself the germ of its own subversion. It creates unease, resistance, eventual breakdown, but stupidity, it believes it's doing good, making it absolutely immune to correction. Schopenhauer's most insight was about how stupidity serves existing power structures. Malicious people know they're doing wrong, which creates internal conflict and eventual breakdown. But people caught in functional stupidity believe they're doing good, making them absolutely resistant to correction. This isn't accidental. Those in power don't need to actively suppress information anymore. They just need to create conditions where processing information honestly becomes prohibitively difficult. When Schopenhauer used the word stupidity, he wasn't talking about low IQ or lack of education. He was describing something far more complex, what we might call functional stupidity or willful ignorance. In his letters from prison, he explained the fact that the stupid person is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent. In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with him as a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him. Here's what made Schopenhauer theory so revolutionary. He argued that stupidity often emerges not from individual failings, but from systemic pressures that make thinking independently both difficult and costly. The truth is, our economic systems actively incentivize intellectual shortcuts. Social media platforms make billions when users react emotionally rather than think critically. News outlets get more clicks with outrage than nuance. Politicians win elections with simple slogans rather than complex policy proposals. When people are working multiple jobs, drowning in debt, and constantly bombarded with information, intellectual surrender becomes a survival strategy. What economists call rational ignorance emerges. It becomes more efficient for individuals to remain uninformed about complex issues, than to invest the time and energy required for genuine understanding. But this individual rationality creates collective irrationality, exactly the dynamic. As Schopenhauer observed in Nazi Germany, the result isn't just individual choice, it's structural pressure toward intellectual surrender, and our brains, stressed and overwhelmed, are perfectly designed to comply. While economic systems push us toward intellectual shortcuts, our brains are actually wired to comply. Schopenhauer groundbreaking research on cognitive dissonance in the 1950s showed exactly how this works psychologically. When people encounter information that contradicts their beliefs, their brains fight to reject it. But here's what Bonhoeffer understood that modern psychology has confirmed. This process is amplified when people are stressed, overwhelmed, or economically insecure. Exactly the conditions our current systems create. Schopenhauer observed that stupidity often emerges in group settings. Writing, it becomes clear that stupidity is not a psychological problem, but a sociological one. He noticed that perfectly rational individuals would abandon their critical thinking abilities when they became part of a larger group or movement. This insight was decades ahead of its time. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments in the 1950s demonstrated exactly what Schopenhauer had witnessed. When surrounded by a group giving obviously wrong answers, 75% of people will go along with the crowd at least once, even when they know the group is wrong. Now imagine how this plays out in our digital age. Social media algorithms create echo chambers that make this transformation easier than ever. A 2018 study by MIT researchers found that false information spreads 6 times faster than true information on social platforms. But here's the crucial insight. It's because false information often feels more emotionally satisfying than complex truths. When someone shares misinformation that confirms their worldview, they're participating in a system that rewards intellectual shortcuts over careful analysis. The algorithm feeds them more of the same, creating echo chambers that act like intellectual quicksand. Have you ever noticed how your social media feed seems to show you exactly what you want to see? That's not an accident. It's the architecture of chosen ignorance in action. We see this pattern play out repeatedly throughout history. The Salem witch trials weren't conducted by evil people, but by God-fearing community members who genuinely believed they were protecting their neighbors. The Red Scare of the 1950s wasn't driven by malicious actors, but by patriotic Americans who sincerely thought they were defending democracy. In each case, intelligent, educated people abandoned critical thinking in favor of group consensus and emotional certainty. If our brains and systems are rigged against us, how do we fight back? Bonhoeffer believed that breaking free from stupidity requires what he called costly grace, the willingness to think independently even when it's painful, unpopular, or dangerous. But now we understand we're not just fighting social pressure. We're fighting millions of years of evolution and billion-dollar algorithms designed to exploit our mental shortcuts. On an individual level, we can cultivate what psychologists call intellectual humility, the recognition that our knowledge is always incomplete and potentially wrong. This means actively seeking out information that contradicts our beliefs, not to torture ourselves, but to test whether our beliefs are worth holding. Here are some concrete practices that can serve as your daily resistance against intellectual surrender. First, practice intellectual friction. Set aside time each week to read thoughtful arguments from people who disagree with you, not to change your mind necessarily, but to test whether your convictions can withstand scrutiny. Second, embrace productive ignorance. When you find yourself absolutely certain about something, ask what evidence would change your mind. If you can't think of any, that's a red flag. Third, slow down your sharing. Before posting anything online, take 60 seconds to verify it from an independent source. That brief pause can break the algorithmic cycle that feeds on our emotional reactions. Finally, practice saying, "I don't know," when you actually don't know something. In a world that rewards confident ignorance over humble uncertainty, admitting gaps in your knowledge becomes a radical act. But individual practices aren't enough. We also need structural changes that make intellectual honesty easier and more rewarding. This means requiring social media platforms to disclose their algorithmic biases and how they curate content. It means funding comprehensive public media literacy, campaigns that teach people how to evaluate sources and evidence. It means designing online platforms that reward intellectual humility over tribal certainty. Most importantly, we need economic policies that reduce the stress and uncertainty that make people vulnerable to intellectual shortcuts. When people aren't constantly worried about healthcare, housing, and employment, they have more mental bandwidth for careful thinking about complex issues. Schopenhauer theory was brilliant for its time, but here's what he couldn't have known. This isn't just about moral surrender or social pressure. Modern neuroscience reveals something far more unsettling. Our brains are literally wired to fall into functional stupidity. Think about it. Schopenhauer witnessed Nazi propaganda spreading through newspapers and radio broadcasts. But we're living through something exponentially more dangerous. We've gone from Nazi propaganda to social media algorithms that know exactly which psychological buttons to push. And now we're entering the age of AI deepfakes that can fabricate reality itself. The threat isn't just escalating, it's targeting the very architecture of human cognition. This isn't just about Nazis or propaganda. It's about the wiring of your brain. Our minds evolved to prioritize speed over accuracy, to trust familiar sources over unfamiliar ones, and to seek information that confirms what we already believe. These were survival features that helped our ancestors make quick decisions when hesitation meant death. The scariest part, we're all vulnerable, no matter how smart we think we are. The mechanism is exactly what Schopenhauer described. When people feel threatened and uncertain, they become more susceptible to authoritative-sounding explanations that reduce complexity to simple narratives. But here's the crucial insight that makes Schopenhauer warning more urgent than ever. We're not just dealing with human manipulation anymore. We're facing systems designed by artificial intelligence to exploit our cognitive vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Every click, every pause, every emotional reaction is being analyzed and weaponized against our capacity for independent thought. We saw this play out in real time during COVID-19. Doctors, engineers, and lawyers, people with demonstrated analytical abilities, began sharing debunked theories about vaccines and treatments. These weren't failures of intelligence. They were failures of intellectual independence under unprecedented pressure. Schopenhauer paid the ultimate price for refusing to surrender his intellectual independence. He was executed by hanging on April 9, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. His last words, according to a fellow prisoner, were, "This is the end for me, the beginning of life." His sacrifice wasn't just about political resistance. It was about defending the very possibility of human thought. He understood that when people stop thinking independently, they stop being fully human, they become, in his words, puppets whose strings are pulled by whatever force happens to be strongest at the moment. But here's what makes Schopenhauer's final challenge so relevant today. Who stands fast when the pressure to conform is overwhelming, when thinking independently requires courage, when the cost of truth is higher than the price of comfortable lies? Who stands fast? The answer isn't found in superior intelligence or education. It's found in the daily choice to remain curious rather than certain, to seek truth rather than comfort, to think carefully rather than react quickly. These aren't heroic acts. They're ordinary practices that become extraordinary when everyone around you has stopped doing them. The tragedy is that intellectual surrender often feels like liberation. Thinking is hard work. It's uncomfortable to hold complex, contradictory ideas in your mind simultaneously. It's painful to admit you might be wrong about something important. But Bonhoeffer argued that this discomfort is the price of remaining human. In a world that profits from our intellectual surrender, choosing to think for ourselves becomes a radical act. This brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all. We're all susceptible to functional stupidity. The moment we think we're immune, we've already begun to succumb. The price of intellectual freedom is eternal vigilance, not against external enemies, but against our own tendency to stop thinking when thinking becomes difficult. Schopenhauer's theory of stupidity is unsettling precisely because it's so accurate. We see it everywhere. Intelligent people believing obviously false things. Educated individuals making catastrophically bad decisions. Well-meaning citizens supporting policies that contradict their own values. The problem isn't that people are getting less intelligent. It's that our systems increasingly reward intellectual shortcuts over careful thinking. But within this sobering diagnosis lies genuine hope. If stupidity is partly chosen, it can also be rejected. If it's partly structural, structures can be changed. If it's the result of cognitive overwhelm, we can create conditions that make thinking easier rather than harder. Think of critical thinking like physical exercise. It's uncomfortable at first, but essential for strength. Just as we wouldn't expect to run a marathon without training, we can't expect to navigate complex information without practicing intellectual discipline. The mental muscles required for independent thought need regular use or they atrophy. The next time you find yourself absolutely certain about something, the next time you catch yourself dismissing contradictory evidence without consideration, the next time you feel the comfort of having all the answers, remember Schopenhauer warning. Functional stupidity doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It whispers that you already know everything you need to know. And in that moment of recognition, you have a choice. Will you surrender your mind for the comfort of certainty? He is always watching, always learning, always guarding the citadel. The door to the cage is open. You have walked out. Don't walk back in just because you miss the company. Keep walking into the dark, into the deep. That is where the treasure is. If this opened your eyes, understand this is only what I can show publicly. There are videos I cannot upload for everyone. There are aspects of dark psychology that I simply cannot discuss publicly on YouTube without being censored or demonetized. The algorithm suppresses the most powerful information. Those exist behind the join button. If you're still here, you're not like the others. Subscribe if you haven't, but if you want what's hidden, click the join button and step into the architect level. You will unlock exclusive uncensored videos that dive into the deepest parts of the human psyche. Most won't, that's the point. Connect with new update comment below your thoughts.